So there's a lot of things that people, where I say controlling the controllables in your life helps to reduce risks. That's, like exercising, maintaining healthy body weight. Those two kind of go hand in hand. Eating a nutrient diverse and rich diet, whether that's fiber, vegetables, all sorts of meat, carbs.
What are the top cancer-fighting foods that people can eat every day for longevity?
Yeah, so something that I preach about quite frequently about is on my channel. Fiber, a lot of fruits and veggies. Of course, it's good to eat a variety of meat sources as well, but I think fiber is incredibly important for promoting effective and efficient digestive health. Obviously, that's more important in some contexts of specific cancer types, like colorectal cancer as an example. But I think people should, in general, incorporate a very diverse array of fiber types in their diet, both fermentable and non-fermentable. Yeah, depending on obviously their ability to handle certain fermentable and non-fermentable food sources.
Yeah, everybody's different, right? Everybody has different tolerances. What are some of your favorite fiber sources, just generally speaking?
I'm not sponsored or endorsed or anything, but I love Metamucil. Obviously, they're the real OG in terms of psyllium husk fiber source, non-fermentable.
Interesting. But yeah, it's like, you don't eat.
But there are a variety of psyllium husk producers. But Metamucil is legit.
Psyllium husk is great from the standpoint of lipids and stuff, but it's not. I mean, it's not really a food. Like from a food standpoint, like, are you like a fan of salads, like just grilled vegetables, or it doesn't really matter?
No, it really doesn't matter. I think just any sort of, so if people like a particular vegetable, just do that. Like incorporate it into your diet. Just be consistent about it. Any sort of vegetables, fruits as well. Obviously, whole foods better than processed foods. So consuming like, whole apple is better than maybe a smoothie because you're going to get some sort of various fibers as well from consuming an apple. Processing it changes a few things, but consuming whole foods, fruits and vegetables, whatever you like, just do it.
Now, how like mechanistically? Because I mean, one of the things I love about you is that, like on your Instagram, on social media, you go deep into the mechanisms. I mean, you are a cancer biologist, so like, how does fiber play like a protective role?
So the degree of which I don't know all of the specifics in terms of the mechanistics components, because I haven't done much colorectal cancer like hands-on research, but from my somewhat limited understanding, which is important in terms of what people need to know about my own background, it helps to regulate the microbiome in the gut. There are a lot of certain people have different inflammatory disorders like irritable bowel syndrome. Or some people, although rare, have HNPCC or Lynch syndrome, and I've spoken about this on Dr. Gabrielle Lyons' podcast as well.
She's great.
Yeah, she's awesome, and we had this discussion as well. Consuming fiber can help to cultivate healthy bacteria within the gut. And of course, that's a very vague statement because there are a variety of different types of bacteria in the gut that can help promote gut health in terms of sustaining or reducing chronic inflammation. And that's going to vary dramatically between people, depending on their diet, genetic background, whether or not they have predispositions genetically through HNPCC or even IBS.
What is the HNPCC? Is that like a
It's
gene?
Lynch syndrome. HNPCC is hereditary. I forgot the
something. It's all good.
Yeah, it's polyposis. I forgot. But anyways, there are genetic contributions to HNPCC. It's a mutation in a few different genes, which are DNA repair genes. And particularly in the gut, it's associated with increased inflammation chronically in the gut. And that can, in these people, increase their likelihood of developing polyps over time. So someone with HNPCC, as an example, has a significantly higher likelihood of developing polyps, and most of them will as they age into their 30s or 40s. I have a friend with HNPCC, so he constantly has to go for colorectal screening, endoscopies and things like that, colonoscopies, and so those people have to be very, very diligent about the amount of and types of fiber that they're consuming.
Meaning it's like it's particularly helpful for that population.
Yeah, and it's one thing that doctors recommend. It's almost like, I know that you often say food is medicine, and I think in this context for that particular demographic of people, food is in context medicine.
There's been pushback to that statement, and I totally get it, that like we need to be clear about what food can and can't do.
Right. And
Right.
in all cases, right? So sorry to interrupt you, but in all cases, food isn't medicinal. It's food. Like we utilize it for our own fuel to sustain our lives, right? That's very basic. But people who have genetic predispositions, that particular food source, specifically something like fiber, can be medicinal in terms of reducing risk for a particular disease.
Oftentimes when the topic of colorectal cancer comes up, you get like usually within the same breath, you hear about the dangers of meat consumption. Where do you stand on that, on like meat as it pertains to carcinogenesis?
Red meat itself, and this is something that's changed over time too, as we've come to understand more through scientific experimentation and meta-analyses and things like that. Red meat itself is not a carcinogen. Oftentimes it's about how we prepare red meats or even meat in general. So it's not even just red meat. A common example I like to give people is if you cook any sort of meat, fish, chicken, red meats, over a high source of heat, that high heat will change the amino acid structures within those proteins to produce carcinogens. So inherently in itself, it is not carcinogenic. But if you prepare it in such a way like grilling, which is obviously the best way to consume a nice ribeye,
Of course.
with a nice marinade,
Yeah.
high heat.
Man after my own heart.
Yeah,
right
of
there.
course.
Yeah.
I mean, who doesn't love a good steak?
Yeah.
But honestly, if you prepare it in such
Well,
a way,
vegans, I guess.
yeah, well, they don't like red meat.
Right.
But outside of them, for whatever reasons, a variety of seemingly ridiculous reasons, they don't prefer to consume red meat, which is my own judgments. I apologize for that. But you can produce a situation where you produce carcinogens. Inherently in itself, it is not carcinogenic. You can argue from a saturated fat perspective that consuming high amounts of saturated fats can promote negative health outcomes. But again, diet should be based on the consumption of a variety of different macronutrients, whether it's protein, various diverse protein sources. You can also obtain protein sources from. So again, in support of the vegans, you can consume a variety, and you should be consuming a diverse variety of plants, just as you should be consuming a diverse variety of animal sources of protein as well. The same is true for carbohydrates. Dr. Gundry is frequently talking about lectins as an example, but lectins, are glycosylated proteins basically. And so if you consume a diverse array of carbohydrates and you're not just consuming lectins, you can offset some of those potentially negative side effects that come from consuming a shit ton of lectins, if that were true, which not necessarily is. The same is true for fats as well, healthy fats. You've talked about this or spoken about this frequently on your platform. So people need to come to consensus about this balance between nutrition and that we can consume food safely without, while reducing disease risks.
Yeah, like I love that. I mean, this is what you get when you talk to like a true expert in the field, such as you are with regard to cancer.
I appreciate that, yeah.
Yeah, but like that context is like everything. And also, correct me if I'm wrong, you're potentially generating carcinogens when you grill meat, but carcinogens are like ubiquitous. It's about equipping your body with the ability to withstand
Correct.
a certain degree of exposure.
Yeah. So, I mean, like you said, carcinogens are all around us. They come in varying different types. So radiation is a carcinogen, some types of radiation, ionizing radiation specifically. I've done posts about that as well. We can offset the effects of being associated with radiation just by existing, because we're on planet Earth and there's not much you can do about, avoiding radiation to some extent. But if you're going to go to the beach, you're putting yourself under, high exposure of ultraviolet radiation. Well, it's not technically ionizing radiation. It can still penetrate through the skin and damage DNA. And if you do that chronically over time on unprotected skin, you increase your risks, especially for me being, Italian and half Jew. I got a lot of moles, man. So I have to be very conscientious about, constantly reapplying sunscreen SPF 30 plus, when I go outside to the beach, because I don't want to increase my risks of developing melanoma. Now, depending on who you are as a human being, you're going to have different risks. Me personally, I need to be very conscientious of that. But yeah. I think in general, when associating with radiation, people should be comfortable with putting on sunscreen. The International Association, sorry, I forgot the IARC. It's a cancer association. They publish all of the known carcinogens, the available evidence associated with those carcinogens, whether or not it's possibly carcinogenic or there's enough evidence to suggest that it is carcinogenic. That's all available online. people can see that information. So people should be able to look at those things and be able to make conscious choices about how they can reduce their risks. Being a firefighter is technically carcinogenic.
Wow.
Because they're associating with carbon monoxide on a regular basis. So as a firefighter, you need to wear very protective equipment so that way you can reduce your risks of inhaling carbon monoxide and increasing your risk for things like lung cancer, gastrointestinal cancers, and things like that. The same could be said about chronic cigarette smokers. Like my mom was a chronic cigarette smoker, and she eventually passed away from esophageal cancer. Now, I'm not saying that one particular event was entirely her fault, because cancer is multifaceted. There are a variety of different causes, but something like smoking cigarettes dramatically increases your risk. So
something like
don't smoke
2,000-fold or more, right?
Yeah. So like just,
very clear direction of causality.
Yeah. It's very clear. And there's even mechanistic components. There's a very beautiful Cell paper, I think published back in I want to say 2016 or 2018, somewhere around that time, that very mechanistically explained and displayed that in a relatively physiological manner, as much as mouse studies can convey, that chronic exposure to cigarette smoke condensate in these mouse models epigenetically transformed otherwise healthy mice into mutating this protein called KRAS, which is an oncogene. So it changed the environment of the lung epithelia over time to eventually become so stressed out that they mutated, the cigarette smoke mutated this oncogene and worsened their lung cancer development models. So yeah, if you're in an environment where you're associated with a lot of smoke, or if you're a firefighter, if you're chronically smoking, you should probably cut back on smoking cigarettes.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I want to go back to food.
I know it's hard too.
No, of course. My dad is a lifelong smoker, and it's been like me and my brothers were just desperately. We're like, is there anything? But at this point, we've just ceded, control, and we've had to realize painfully that people just live the way that they want to live. But
not to cut you off though, real quick, and it doesn't go without saying that you can smoke an entirety of a lifetime and not get cancer. My grandmother is an example of that as well. Good old Lillian Palambella smoked a pack until she was from 17 till she passed at 93.
Wow.
So cancer is very complex of a disease. It's not just like if I smoke for the entirety of my life, I'm going to get cancer. No, it's a multitude of factors, and a lot of that is very, very complicated, both genetically and environmentally.
So do you think that your grandma was just genetically, she had a degree of resilience?
To some extent, but she also was very conscientious of her diet. So there are other, so you can associate with carcinogens in your life, and as we all do, varying degrees of which we do. But you can do things in your life to offset the risks of maybe poor behavioral choices that you've associated or developed over your lifetime. So as an example, I don't think she was genetically superior and that she could just handle cigarette smoke better, but she reduced her risks in other ways.
How, aside from,
so good diet, she exercised somewhat regularly as well. She was, she wasn't obese. She maintained a relatively healthy body weight. So there's a lot of things that people, where I say controlling the controllables in your life helps to reduce risks. That's, like exercising, maintaining healthy body weight. Those two kind of go hand in hand. Eating a nutrient diverse and rich diet, whether that's fiber, vegetables, all sorts of meat, carbs, you name it.
Foods rich in antioxidants.
Yeah.
You mentioned radiation. So, I have to ask, are our cell phones giving us cancer?
I've spoken about this to very simple lengths on my page. Currently, there isn't enough evidence to suggest that cell phones are capable of causing cancer. Now, there are a variety of people on social media that have made very conclusive statements, very, very popular channels. But the EMFs, electromagnetic fields even, emitted from phones are not capable of penetrating your skin in a particular way that's going to induce damage in a chronic way to cause cancer.
Now, is this the jury is still out kind of situation, or
it's and I hate to say this, but it's basic physical principles. We know the ability of certain electromagnetic waves and fields and their ability to penetrate anything. So like there's a very big difference between alpha particles, beta particles, ionizing radiation in terms of how they can penetrate surfaces. For example, ionizing radiation can penetrate through most things. Gamma rays can penetrate through most things, but their ability to ionize particles is very different than alpha particles. So as specific elements decay, in their decaying, they emit alpha particles. I'm not a physicist, but they emit particles that have greater potential at damaging DNA despite their inability to penetrate through a surface. So although gamma rays and ionizing radiation, they can penetrate through surfaces like this table, like our skin, very rapidly, most of the time they'll just like pass right through. And they won't have that opportunity or that window of opportunity to interact with DNA and damage it in a chronic way to cause cancer. Whereas something like an alpha particle or an X-ray has greater potential.
Yeah.
That's a very hardcore physics lesson that I don't, that's quantum physics at its core too, which I still don't understand. I don't think even quantum physicists still understand the complex components associated with that as well. But
super interesting. But so like needless to
EMFs
say,
are super weak. They just bounce right off your skin. So even if like I've heard again from very notable people that, you know, having your cell phone in your pocket can increase your risks for cancer, but it's like, if your cell phone is emitting that much radiation, you bought a bad phone.
Interesting.
And it wouldn't be released to consumers if they knew, at least I'm saying with good conscience, it wouldn't be released to consumers if they knew that it emitted that much radiation or that much heat to cause health problems.
And probably like most people have much bigger fish to fry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is cancer incidence increasing? Like, are we seeing more cancer now than we have in the past?
Yes. And I think a lot of the reason for that is because we're also getting better at treating cancer. And I will say that I think that cancer is a disease of aging. As a human species, we're all getting older. And so as we live more through time, aging, we increase our likelihoods just by living of getting cancer, because there's this very fine balance of all species on life, not even just humans, not like we're not special. There's a very fine balance between life and death. And so if we constantly are fighting against death, nature, and I don't mean to sound kind of like quacky here, but nature has a way of kind of figuring things out. Yeah. And this is true across, you know, even less developed species. We see this in plants all the time, botany. And actually on the flight over here, I watched the entire series of Green Planet. You know, it's one of the sequels to Blue Planet, David Attenborough.
Oh, he's the man.
Yeah, it's incredible. So like that series kind of conveys this point that nature has a very, very regulated and controlled way of keeping things in balance. And humans are a part of the ecosystem as well in terms of mediating this.
It's interesting. There's this concept of antagonistic pleiotropy, which I think is fascinating, that, you know, like nature.
Can you explain that real quick?
Yeah. I mean, the way that I understand it is that there are traits that set us up to reach a degree of reproductive success that are beneficial during one part of our lifespan, that are maybe counterproductive at the other end of our lifespan. So for example, some of these pathways that regulate growth, you know, that are really important when it comes to the development and maintenance of muscle mass, for example. You know, later in life, or when dysregulated, can promote the growth of like tumor cells, for example.
Yeah.
And so it's like this like double-edged sword of biology.
Yeah.
You know?
So and one thing that you've spoken about to some lengths on your page, and I've even helped you develop captions for this in talking about IGF, but insulin like growth factor. But there are a variety of different growth factors which can drive cancers, as you know, depending on who you are throughout your development of life. You know, HER2 receptors in breast cancer, growth factors that bind to the HER2 receptor. EGFR, epidermal growth factor receptor, so epidermal growth factor. TGF beta, transforming growth factors. There's a variety of different growth factors that have been implicated and have these very double-edged processes in terms of development, but also in terms of cancer promotion. So as going back to this condition of balance, it's super important that in some conditions, these things are very, 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 very important in terms of our development as a human being from when we're embryos to adults. But they can play very, very important roles in terms of the development of diseases like cancer, not only cancer, diseases like diabetes and obesity and things like that as well.
But are there aspects of the modern environment that are, because you mentioned that cancer is increasing partly because we've just gotten better at detecting it and treating it. But like, would you say that the modern environment, whether it's the food environment or our increasing exposure to carcinogens, like is also increasing the rates at which we're developing these conditions?
Yeah, I mean, certainly tanning culture isn't healthy. But yeah, there are certain things within our environment that we do have control over. But, depending on where you grow up, we don't always have the greatest control over reducing risks to specific factors, which we know can worsen or promote cancer. So again, it comes back to controlling the controllables. If I grew up in a society, as an example, like I grew up, my mom was very conscientious about us consuming, a bunch of diverse foods, having, she'd cook us lunch, she'd help prepare us meals, and we'd have a pretty healthy dinner with, vegetables and, lasagna and all this other shit she'd put at the table, excuse my language. But I grew up in an environment where I'm so used to eating a pretty diverse diet and balanced nutritional profile that now making conscientious decisions when I go to a restaurant is a lot easier than, say, somebody who grows up in a lower socioeconomic status. I did as well, but maybe with reduced availability to healthier whole foods, maybe more availability to processed foods. And trust me, I know that's not easy too, because my parents also owned a candy store. So I have an absolutely horrid sweet tooth. But, my mom was like, you can have one candy bar, but this shouldn't be the primary source of your nutrition. So again, it's about, it's a little bit about privilege. Diets are privilege, as an example.
Well, one thing that's for sure about the modern environment is that the food environment has seemingly predisposed us all to gaining more weight than we perhaps have in the past.
Yeah.
I mean, we're at the point now where 1 in 2 people are almost obese, like not just overweight, but obese. And you mentioned obesity briefly, but like, what's the relationship there?
Okay. So
between obesity and cancer?
Yeah. So to give you some facts associated with obesity and cancer, obesity is associated, at least right now, associated with 13 different types of cancer. And that's just like information from the National Cancer Institute. And AACR and those sort of cancer associations or foundations. But in the Western world, particularly in the United States, processed foods are becoming more and more prominent and easier access. So, excuse me, our associations with these hyper palatable foods and these processed foods are increasing our risks for obesity. And the way that obesity is linked to cancers is because it causes, and I say this very loosely and very vaguely, metabolic dysregulation between the organs that kind of help us digest food, whether it's the pancreas, kidney, stomach, liver, as an example. So like people who have, high exposure to processed foods, they develop obesity. Fatty liver disease as a component of this in terms of obese people. They have an increased likelihood for developing things like liver cancer, kidney cancer, pancreatic cancer. So I studied that for quite a bit. But yeah, it's kind of the link between obesity and cancers.
So by becoming not obese, if you are obese, is that a prevention strategy that is worthwhile?
Yeah, so I certainly think that maintaining a healthy level of visceral adiposity, because obesity in itself is quite complicated. Some people have genetic predispositions. They hold weight a little bit more easily than maybe some of us, and maybe I'm just genetically, lucky to not be obese.
Yeah, pretty swole.
I also go through a lot of effort to try and maintain my health too. Like I said, I grew up in an environment where physical activity was very important, maintaining health. But again, some people don't grow up in that particular environment. So yes, maintaining a healthy level of visceral adiposity in regards to obesity is a great preventative strategy that I think we need to push in society in terms of reducing the risks of obesity and cancer.
Yeah. One of the unmistakable characteristics of the standard American diet is just the overabundance of added sugar. I think your average adult today consumes something like 77 grams of added sugar every single day, which is like 20 teaspoons almost of like pure sugar for which we have no biological necessity. You hear often that sugar feeds cancer.
So by sugar, you mean what? Glucose?
Yeah, or just, I mean, generally in the colloquial sense, you hear that sugar feeds cancer. And so I think a lot of people will interpret that to mean like the sugar that they're eating. Is that an accurate statement?
Sugar does feed cancer, but sugar, particularly glucose as an example, feeds pretty much all your cells in your body. So I think a lot of this notion that sugar feeds cancer or sugar causes cancer is from our observations that, especially established in the early 1900s through Otto Warburg's findings, or the Warburg effect, as you may have heard. Cancer cells, they have an increased uptake of glucose. So they essentially increase the amount of a receptor on a surface, which increases the intake of glucose. And that glucose is a fuel source by which they can push into the citric acid cycle. And their citric acid cycle, depending on the type of cancer, kind of takes this glucose, breaks it down for energy, depending on where that tumor originated. And it's going to vary very dramatically between cancers. So it's just like a means to an end that they upregulate this receptor to take in more glucose. But all of our cells, to some extent, utilize some receptors to bring glucose into the cells, particularly the brain. So as an example, when somebody gets a PET scan, the brain is just glowing. Brain loves glucose. So in a PET scan, when you're trying to look for somebody that has a potential tumor, they'll have to reduce the background glowing of a radioisotope of glucose to determine which regions in the body are absorbing more glucose relative to the overall environment. And it's not perfect, obviously, because you're weeding out background noise, because technically all your cells will glow to some extent. You just have to reduce the intensity of light that is going into the imager so you can determine which ones are more relative to the region. And this is a very common thing we see in microscopy techniques. But a lot of people at the surface level, they don't understand that. And so it's easy to assume that just because there's increased glucose uptake in cancer cells, that it's causing that particular cancer or making it worse. And it can. But starving a cancer cell of glucose will affect the entire body, not just the cancer cells. And the difference between your normal cells and cancer cells, normal cells have a way of maintaining life, but it's very, very regulated. So they will become unhealthy if you starve them of glucose. Cancer cells will figure out a new way. They'll metabolize an amino acid source. They'll take from the environment and metabolize an amino acid source. In a particular cancer type I studied, they'll often upregulate this enzyme called glutaminase 1 in the citric acid cycle, and it pushes glutaminase into the citric acid cycle from a different perspective. Instead of taking in glucose, now you're taking from a different perspective, grabbing an amino acid to enter from a different route. Cancer cells are very adaptive. Life itself is very adaptive. But the difference between, again, a cancer cell and a normal cell is cancer cells, they have a variety of different mechanisms to adapt much quicker.
They're sneaky.
They circumvent normal safeguards that otherwise normal cells have very, very careful checkpoints to avoid.
Wow. I mean, it's so interesting because, like, I mean, that might, if you hear something like that on social media, perhaps like sugar feeds cancer, you might be inclined to say, well, then I've got to go on a zero carbohydrate diet. But I think one of the nuances that's often missed is that, well, you can't live with zero sugar in your blood. There is this like background level of sugar in your blood. And if you deprive yourself of sugar, well, your liver is going to create sugar to support your brain, right? Your brain can't go sugar free.
Gluconeogenesis,
Yeah. So, but would you say then that it's like,
which gluconeogenesis is also upregulated in things like liver cancer to circumvent that as well.
Wow. It's crazy.
So life is incredibly adaptive. I don't think people give enough justice to how beautiful it is, despite it being a disease. And this is something that I try and convey to people, because in those complexities, we can begin to understand not only the foundations of biology, but just how amazing not only our bodies are, but life is, how amazing life is in terms of adapting different strategies to overcome something like just consuming a different amount of or lower amount of sugar.
So what is the connection between sugary foods and cancer? Is it purely that those sugary foods over consuming them puts us at higher risk of obesity, or is it that the sugar that we're eating, if it's a very high sugar food, like a sugar sweetened beverage, is directly feeding the cancer? Or is it just that, like, when you eat lots of sugary foods, you're displacing foods that are more nutritious and antioxidant rich?
It's both. Yeah. So it's both. And obviously it's going to depend on who you are as a person. I'm going to say that often. Everything's contextual. But it's both. Yeah. So I think you've already kept it simple enough for people. And I think that's just what it is.
Yeah. Super. I mean, it's such an important and nuanced topic. And I love that you got into it because of your mom, right?
Yeah. So I think you and I align in this in terms of how we both got into our fields. Yeah. So I was on, and a lot of this is explained by my tattoo as well. It kind of describes my scientific journey. I started my scientific career kind of as a marine biologist. So I've always had this fascination with the ocean in terms of, like, again, just a beautiful ecosystem. So I've taken a variety of courses in marine ecology, evolution, botany, ecosystem conservation, those sorts of things. So when I initially went to school, I went for marine biology. But in high school, my mom got sick with esophageal cancer when I was 14, almost 15, and didn't really know how to process it. And at the time, I was still on the marine bio track. You're a young kid. I think at that age, most people are interested in marine bio, but I really stuck with it. But then, my mom's cancer progressed. She, got treated, went through chemo, wrecked her, as chemo does. It's tough to kind of get the body back to a state of balance to where, the tumor isn't growing and you're maintaining health. She went into remission, and then cancer came back with a vengeance, and just the thing she died of was actually a heart attack.
Wow.
And so I was 17 when she passed away. And at that time,
I'm sorry, dude.
I'm sorry. It's tough too. Like, you went through a very similar thing. It's tough to see somebody that you love, that's your hero, pass away from a disease. But to me, that was motivating. I had two options. I could either let my emotions override my brain and just negatively affect the course of my life, or just try and do something about it. So I became obsessed with it, and I dropped the marine bio track that I was on. It also wasn't working out. And I also figured out that I was just good at understanding biochemistry. And a lot of cancer biology, at least from a biochemical perspective, is very metabolic, very biochemical. So I got very, very much obsessed with trying to figure out what caused my mom's cancer, what made it worse, why various lifestyle factors, that were out of her control may have been contributors. What sort of things could she have done to maybe reduce risks? It wasn't her fault. It's a very, very complicated disease. And then over time, I will say this, and I've said this to many people, that my pursuit of my degree was purely therapeutic. And I didn't seek charlatanism to try and, like, satisfy my educational curiosity. I knew the right way to do it was to consult the literature, go through a professional education, learn how to logically think about research, cancer biology, and be able to, at the end of the day, and I still don't know everything, so I don't think people should know or think that I know everything about cancer, but at the end of the day, be able to learn the foundations of cancer biology to be able to feel okay. Not only teaching others, but feel okay myself, and knowing that my mom's cancer wasn't her fault, that it's a very complex disease. And so my own education was just my pursuit of just learning how to cope with my loss. Yeah.
Yeah, I can so relate. I mean, my mom actually passed from pancreatic cancer, which she developed or which she was diagnosed with over Labor Day of 2018. And if I can add something to this conversation, I'm obviously not a cancer expert, but one of the things that stood out to me was part of the reason why my mom's cancer was untreatable. It was caught late, which, and I know that you can speak to this more authoritatively than I can, but I know that pancreatic cancer is often caught late. So that was part of it. It was caught at a point at which the doctors had seen evidence that it had already metastasized. But the other issue is that a person's success when going through something like chemotherapy, which, as you alluded to, is very hard to go through, it depends on what is referred to as a patient's performance status, which is like how robust they are, in body. And my mom, because of her dementia at the time, was already so frail and so just not with it, that the doctors didn't think that putting her through that would have been a smart move, and that it wouldn't have been successful anyway because of her low performance.
Late stage disease too.
Yeah, late stage disease and low performance status. And so to me, what that suggests is that, if there's a point, God forbid, that anybody listening to this, were to one day receive that diagnosis, there's a lot of work that you can do that we should all be doing prior to that to ensure that were we to need any such treatment down the line, that we would be able to go through it and come out at the other end as strong as possible.
Yeah.
And, and that's where like a lot of the stuff that we talk about on this podcast, whether it's like resistance training and eating a healthy diet, a diet that, supports muscle protein synthesis and all that stuff, sleeping well, mitigating stress, becomes super, super important.
Yeah. And I think there's, and again, I'm very sorry for your mom. Pancreatic cancer, one of the tough things is it's hard to detect. And, when it's caught late, and I say this very, very sentimentally, it's a death sentence. So there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of detecting pancreatic cancer earlier. There's a lot of really cool blood tests coming out too that may be better at detecting early stage disease regarding like things like pancreatic cancer, as well as circulating tumor DNA. A company called Grail is working on this. But another thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of preventative strategies that we can implement, even before somebody gets cancers, again, going back to fiber, we're finding even that those through meta-analyses, and I can send you these PMIDs later because, I think evidence is very important, obviously.
We love a PMID.
We love PMIDs, yes. Something like fiber can enhance the efficacy of a lot of therapies, particularly immunotherapies. So we found through these meta-analyses that those who consumed higher amounts of fiber, just overall, independent of the type, had better outcomes regarding immunotherapy by this antibody that targets an immune suppressive protein on cancer cells. So those who had higher fiber intake had better response to this therapy in colorectal cancer.
Wow.
So going back to the colorectal cancer sort of thing, but those are sort of things that, God forbid, should we do the things that we can, what we have control over, and we'd still get cancer, we should know those risk reducing strategies even going into it, and then also how those will change as we get cancer. And so we're learning a lot about how dietary strategies can affect cancer outcomes as well, not only just through fiber, but also examining things like low carbohydrate diets, not in a chronic sense, also ketogenic diets, again, not in a chronic sense. I guess that would be low carb. But they can provide windows of opportunity to kind of change the epigenome about how cancer cells are metabolizing various fuel sources like glucose. So if we know, like most tumors, they increase their uptake of glucose, and I reduce the amount of glucose that's available to those tumors, I can combine that dietary intervention with a chemotherapy that maybe didn't work when glucose was present. Now I can change the environment of that tumor to make it more sensitive to that chemotherapy. So they're tiny windows of opportunity. And again, I spoke about this to some detail on Gabrielle Lyon's podcast. But again, I don't want people thinking that dietary strategies alone are efficacious in treating disease. Right now, they only appear to be efficacious in combination with therapies because you need to provide that environment to change the metabolism of cancer cells so that you can add the drug to target the appropriate mechanism of action. And actually, dietary strategies like ketogenic diets in clinical models or preclinical models actually alone show to make tumors potentially worse in some contexts.
Interesting.
They can help in other contexts.
Did it depend on like the type of cancer?
Yeah, it depends on type, stage. So again, it always depends on when you catch the cancer as well. Metabolism, as a tumor develops, whether it's a solid or blood-based tumor, as it develops, it'll change over time. Life evolves, right? Especially as you get older and things like that. Things change. So we're also determining not only what to treat with, but when to treat, and how those strategies change over time between cancers. So there's a very dynamic approach that needs to be performed when examining how we treat cancers, as opposed to older methods that are just like give everybody cisplatin, give everybody paclitaxel. And we see variable responses with those drugs. Some people respond very well, some people don't. And I think a lot of it is because we're not always considering the dynamic nature of how that disease has progressed in that person. We need personalized strategies. It's very hard to come up with that information.
Is it true that we all have like cancerous cells in us at any given time?
No. Again, life is all about balance, particularly within our own body. I've heard this very, very commonly that that we all have some degree of cancer, that we're always fighting off cancer. But that's not true, because assuming we're all healthy beings when we're born, we have certain predispositions maybe for cancer, depending on who we are, our genetic background. But we also have our ability to control our environment to, that's again, risk reduction strategies that we've already spoken about. But no, we don't all start with cancer. Yeah. If that were true, we'd kind of all be screwed, because cancer in many ways has greater advantages and adaptability than normal cells. Again, as I mentioned, previously, like life has checkpoints that need to be met, and death is a big part of life. We live, cells have a finite amount of times that they can divide, and then once they reach their tail end, they die. It's a very normal part. We have cells in us right now dying, and then certain cells taking those resources and rebuilding new molecules. And then eventually one day that homeostasis, or that level of balance, will wean off, and then that's what death is. But cancer cells have this remarkable ability to circumvent those checkpoints, as I'd said, to go past them by affecting the molecules of those checkpoints. So frequently we see, as the cell cycle goes on, we see downregulation or sometimes even mutation of these cell cycle checkpoint regulators to sustain continuous growth so that the cells can continue dividing. So that's essentially kind of like what is cancer, right? So it's this ability to continuously pass these checkpoints to a point where it's not normal, and they can continue to grow despite those stop signals that normal cells follow.
Do you think that within our lifetimes we're going to see a cure for cancer?
We've already seen cures for cancer, but again, it's relative. Suggesting a cure for any disease globally kind of ignores the nuance and complexity of that disease, because there are technical cures already through chemotherapeutics and immunotherapies and a variety of different strategies, even surgical techniques that have cured people of cancer, and they've managed to stay cancer-free for the rest of their life. That is a technical cure, but it's not the same response in everybody. So I think people need to understand that something can be a cure but not work in everybody, and that just goes to show you, again, the heterogeneity not only amongst cancers but in disease in general.
What are, in your view, the most exciting new therapies?
I'm slightly biased because I'm also in the immunotherapy space. I work on a type of bispecific antibodies, and basically it's an antibody is like a Y-shaped molecule. We can develop one arm to target like a cancer antigen, something that cancer cells uniquely express, or something that's upregulated, increased on the cell surface of a cancer cell. One arm to target that, and then one arm of the antibody to target an immune component that we can kind of home that immune cell to a cancer type and promote anti-immunity against that particular cancer. So basically using our own immune system to fight fight against cancers. And those have been pretty efficacious in not only preclinical studies, but in clinical trials. That's why a lot of FDA approval is coming for, or even has already been approved for, a lot of immunotherapies upon a variety of different targets. I've mentioned a few. There's a PD-L1, PD-1. This receptor that cancer cells will upregulate to suppress an immune cell called a T cell, because they don't want the T cells recognizing them. So if we block that interaction with something like an antibody, the T cell can now be activated and emit its anti-cancer effects against that particular cancer. So immunotherapies are very important. I think also an upcoming field that I'd like to see improved is targeted radiation, because systemic radiation is obviously systemic, very damaging to the body. Seeing somebody go through radiation it's kind of heartbreaking. One of the things that affects cancer patients the most is cachexia. So it's extreme muscle wasting. And a lot of this can be induced by damage associated with chemotherapeutics and systemic radiation. So I think an area that needs dramatic improvement in terms of targetability is how we guide radioactive isotopes or labels to a particular set of cancer. And we can also use antibodies to do this.
So right now, like chemotherapy is like you're injecting poison into your body essentially on a systemic scale. And so this is like taking a more targeted approach to the tumor.
I will also say that chemotherapy in itself is targeted. So that's why whenever people describe chemotherapy as a poison, it's kind of, it triggers me a little bit. It's upsetting because it's not technically poison. It has negative health effects associated with it, technically poisonous, but it's developed upon a very specific mechanistic premise. So like I mentioned cisplatin earlier. Cisplatin's mechanism of action is to target DNA replication. And what cisplatin does is it integrates within, cancer cells. They have this higher rate of DNA replication. They make more DNA because they need to divide more. And so what cisplatin will do is it'll integrate within that DNA and cause damage. And so those cells that are actively replicating and dividing, they can't do that anymore. They'll be committed to cell death, because those normal cell death pathways that are in normal cells are also in cancer cells. And those cancer cells will be committed to dying at that point. There are ways that cancer cells can circumvent cell death too.
Oof.
That's why often we combine chemotherapeutics. So let's say we'll combine cisplatin with something like another inhibitor for resisting cell death, olaparib. I don't need, the targets of these don't necessarily matter for the audience, but we'll target multiple specific components of how that cancer cell that we've determined clinically and experimentally, we'll target multiple components at the same time, so that the way it reduces the likelihood of that cancer from continuing to do its thing as cancer. And
Wow.
of course, that will affect normal healthy cells as well, but the degree of which should hypothetically be less than the cancer cells.
Well, it seems to me that like immunotherapy is, like, for lack of a better term, the more natural, like it's just brilliant to be able to tune our immune systems to focus on the tumor.
Yeah.
So what are the like the roadblocks? Like if we have like brilliant people such as yourself, like working diligently night and day on these kinds of therapeutics, on this technology, like what are the hurdles? Like why haven't we cured this thing yet?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point, and thanks for calling me brilliant. I don't certainly think so, but inquisitive for sure. I think one of the important things regarding immunotherapies is that people also need to understand that no therapy is perfect. Immunotherapies have a lot of issues. Too much of a good thing can be bad, right? So if I induce too much of an immune response against a particular tumor, your immune response can also damage you as well. It can cause things like autoimmunity. So we need to temper how well a therapy works, just as we do with small molecules, just like cisplatin or olaparib. We need to temper how well they work when they're working, the same as we do with small molecules. So something that we commonly see with immunotherapies is like cytokine storms, at least in the preclinical perspective. We want to produce or regulate the rate of interaction between that antibody and its target, so that way it's not stuck there. You don't want it to be too high interacting or too high affinity with those things that we design. So that way it sustains an immune reaction against that particular tumor, because those immune cells, if that interaction is sustained, they'll produce too much of a particular response in the form of like secreting these proteins. It's called cytokines, various versions of cytokines, and they all do very different things in the immune system, but that can damage your body as well. So we have to mitigate how well these things bind to their intended target, not so strongly, but it's like the Goldilocks sort of effect. We have to do it just right. And I don't think people realize just how hard that is from any clinical perspective, whether it's small molecule, whether it's immunotherapy. We have to always find this just right. And it's damn near impossible to do.
Yeah. And every cancer is different. Every patient's different.
Yeah.
Yeah. You've definitely got your work cut out for you.
Like anybody who studies any disease, like it's just our body trying to survive. There's no evolutionary advantage to having something like cancer, but cancer cells, they're ourselves. They just have issues. So we need to figure out, the things that they have greater issues with, but it's still like normal tissues will also have those things. They're just functioning normally. And so cancer cells, they're us, but they'll just adapt in a different way because they're part of the disease.
So what makes a normal healthy cell go bad and become cancerous?
Yeah, so a lot of it is, there's mutational components associated with disease. Like I mentioned, people have specific predispositions for a variety of different types of cancers, whether it's heritable between, parents, but it doesn't always have to be. We can have some spontaneous generation due to our association with, known carcinogens, something like cigarette smoke, which I mentioned briefly.
So like DNA damaging agents.
Exactly. Yeah. Oxidizing agents. Even like hyperassociations with, oxidized fats can induce a metabolic state, which can increase the likelihood for some specific types of cancers, which is, one thing that increases likelihood for something like liver cancer as well, or even pancreatic cancer. So that's why we, regulate our intake of fried chicken as much as I love it.
Yeah. So can we talk about that a little bit? Because I know that I don't want to paint you as like an anti-seed oil person.
I'm not.
Regular listeners to my show know where I stand. I try to avoid them, but seed oils are predominantly, when talking about the industrially refined, bleached and deodorized seed oils. So we're not talking about flaxseed oil. We're not talking about like sesame seed oil, but we'll just take soybean oil because it's so common today. Very easily oxidizable fat. We've shared studies in our DMs with one another about showing where they'll feed mice that are prone to colorectal cancer
or even IBS.
Yeah. These kinds of fats from the fryers at restaurants. So like fats that have been used in the fryer setting at restaurants. And they see like upregulation of various like inflammatory processes, tumor growth and things like that. In what context do we need to be concerned about these oils? And in what context do you think that they're, maybe less dangerous as some might portray them?
So I think, and it's going to be controversial, I think you have a very healthy approach in terms of avoiding seed oils. It's important that people understand that fried food is not healthy for you. If I go to McDonald's every day and I eat the fries and you've got that worker that's underpaid and overworked, manning the fryer, how often do you think they're going to change out the oils? So every oil, soybean oil, every oil has a particular oxidation rate. Now, when we process an oil, hypothetically, we're reducing the likelihood of that oil source to be oxidized because it's going through a purification stage where the impurities are being taken out of that oil. And so we're reducing the amount of oxidizing agents in that oil. And that's what's typically being used in the fryer. But oils, they can still be broken down with high heat, just like, proteins can be heated under high heat and producing carcinogens. If you heat an oil consistently without changing it over time at a very high heat, depending on the oil, they have various different tolerances depending on the composition of a particular oil source, whether it's extra virgin olive oil or soybean oil or any oil source. If you heat it enough, you're going to produce oxidized fats. And so that's why it's important to change out that oil source to reduce the likelihood of consuming those oxidized fat species. But that's not happening at the McDonald's man by the 15-year-old with zits all over his face and he's just trying to get through high school.
Yeah.
but I didn't mean that to target anybody. I swear to God. It's So I think again, people just need to understand that, if you consume too much of these foods, you're going to have increased risks for negative health outcomes. You can avoid them completely or just reduce your consumption. I'll be the first to tell you that sometimes I crave McDonald's fries. I don't eat them every day, but if I'm on the way home and I'm like, man, I had a shit day, you know what would really make me feel better right now? A Frosty from Wendy's or something like that, or like one of the, whatever the fuck McDonald's has, and some French fries and just dip it in the
McFlurry?
McFlurry.
Is that what it is? Wow.
Whatever.
I haven't been to a McDonald's in like decades,
Yeah.
but I'm even impressed that I remember that.
Yeah. But, if I'm feeling like that, I'll just go get it. But again, moderation is important.
So the whole seed oil thing is like, it's a controversial topic, but would you say that it's less controversial to say that fryer oil is unhealthy?
Yes.
Okay.
Fryer oil is unhealthy.
Okay.
I think we can say that with
we can agree on that.
certainty. Yeah. But I think that there's an important conversation that needs to be had about the negative health effects of seed oils within particular diseases. Like an example would be that study. Seed oils can, even in the absence of heat, they can be metabolized by our body to produce oxidized species. Again, right now, even though neither of us ate oxidized fat species from a fryer today, right now we do have fats being oxidized, producing oxidized species in us right now. And that produces interesting metabolic responses and sometimes necessary metabolic responses in our body that are completely normal. But yeah, I think in general, there are negative health effects to seed oils, but still there's a lot that remains to be determined about those in the literature. So I don't think we can say with a really strong degree of certainty that all seed oils are unhealthy, but people definitely need to understand the context of where they can be implemented into their diet so that way they're not increasing their likelihood for specific diseases.
Yeah, I think the problem is that you get a lot of these zealots on social media that like will paint all seed oils as bad without and promote that idea without any nuance. You know? So it leaves a lot of people scared to consume things like sesame oil, which we know very long-lived populations consume. Like sesame oil is pretty commonly used in the Japanese diet, which we know is associated with longevity. Flaxseed oil may be beneficial, although I think it's a suboptimal source of omega-3s if anybody's consuming it for omega-3s compared to like fish oil. But then even fish oil, now there's a growing cadre of people online that are like fish oil is bad for you against all available evidence.
I think it's very easy to take a strong position on something, but it's even more challenging to understand the implications of that position that you've taken. So we see this frequently within like the people who choose carnivore diets, people who choose vegan diets. There's these very strong positions that I think that these people need to critically think more about their dietary choices. From a more thorough biological perspective in terms of like human physiology, that I think that they're making these strong conclusions upon insufficient evidence. And I think once they start to examine those particular things, they'll be able to make better choices. But the issue is it's often ego-based. And I don't mean this to like insult anybody, but we all need to let our egos go at the end of the day. As a scientist, it's incredibly important for me to do ethical and thorough work if I can let my own inherent biases go as I'm approaching an experiment. Like I said, I love red meat just like anybody, but if I go in with the bias of a vegan and I'm doing a study about red meat and cancer, I'm shooting myself in the foot. I have to get rid of that bias if I'm to do good work. And so I think in order to be understanding of the literature, we need to be able to have those uncomfortable discussions and rid ourselves of our biases to be able to have respectful conversations about these things that, science changes over time. We could discover something tomorrow that says the vegan diet is better than any other diet, or the Mediterranean diet, which is very good as well. But like, again, it's about openness to discussion and being willing to be wrong, which as a scientist, I can tell you I'm wrong more than 99% of the time, because as we've very explicitly stated, disease is incredibly complicated, whether it's cancer, whether it's obesity, diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, horribly complicated. And by taking extreme points, we oversimplify something that isn't simple.
And it doesn't do anybody any favors. Like, it's not good for the patients.
No.
It's not good for the family members to come across some sensationalized, oversimplified falsehood, right? That provides false hope.
Yeah.
And see, this is where like some, and granted, a very small minority, but some in the evidence-based camp will get will see a thin slice of something that that I've said, that and then come after me. But actually, what I think those people don't realize that I'm just as much against misinformation as anybody else, because I actually had a sick family member who I think in many ways was hurt by in her case, the dietary misinformation of the prior decades that steered her away from nutrient dense, foods, animal products in particular, and towards these highly marketed, super high profit margin, ultra processed foods.
Right.
And so I'm super like on board with this. Like we need to have a more nuanced conversation about these kinds of complicated topics. And that's why I so respect the work that you're doing. And I'm super glad that over the past year or two, we've been able to like chat, collaborate even on some posts. Yeah. And yeah, I think it's crucial.
Yeah. I think again, people need to get rid of those, personal biases and just be able to have respectful discussion. We've had disagreements. I don't think that there's going to be any time where in a friendship somebody doesn't have a disagreement. If you're not having healthy disagreements amongst friends, you probably don't want to be a friend with that person.
Yeah.
Because it means that they're just trying to implement their biases upon you. And it's also like it's really easy nowadays to attack somebody like yourself with a large platform. And I imagine as I grow on my own platform, I'm going to run into similar issues where I'm going to piss some people off. And I already have. I've pissed off a lot of people by my approach about how I convey science. But we can't please everybody. But the thing that I like about your platform is that you're doing your best with what you have. And I've spoken to my friend, Dr. Joey Munoz about this. And, it would be stupid to assume that we're always correct in what we say. But, being truly evidence-based means we go about the evidence, we make our interpretations, and we're open to discussing whether or not our interpretations are true or false. This just comes with being a good scientist. And I don't care whether, and this isn't just to you, but I don't care if you have a PhD or not. It shouldn't matter to have a productive discussion. If my goal is to educate you, especially as somebody who has a formal education, I'd be shooting myself in the foot if I wasn't open to having a discussion and trying to educate you on the things that I know, and also being open to learn the things that you know that I don't. And a lot of people go in to conversation with this pushiness to impose their ideas on other people and their unwillingness to learn something from the other party. Again, I'd be a fool to assume that I know everything and that you know, or you don't know things that I do.
Well, you're very humble. You're very grounded. I mean, you're obviously super smart. You're an expert in your field, but it's like in academia, typically, you get a lot of like big egos, a lot of territorialism, which you see sometimes bubble up on social media. And it's frustrating because, I don't think that everybody necessarily should have a seat at the table. But as I was saying to Joey Munoz on a prior episode of the show, that throughout history you can look to various fields that have had contributions made by people from outside of those fields.
Yeah. And
so we have to, I think, remain open-minded.
Yeah. I mean, the most productive discussions are had between obviously open-minded people. If we don't go into discussion with that level of open-mindedness, how can we expect that we're going to change the paradigm or even challenge the paradigm of things that we believe to be true?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The mind functions like a parachute, best when open.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about, so something that I see a lot about, and people will ask me this, you see, especially here in California, on certain products that otherwise would seem safe, right? Like coffee, you get sometimes this like warning.
Yeah. Prop 65 or something like that.
Is that what it is?
Or
yeah.
Prop 95 or some shit.
This product contains compounds known in the state of California to cause cancer. I think that actually happened recently with coffee, or within recent years. Coffee, the roasting process generates a compound I think called acrylamide. I could be wrong. Don't quote me on that. But
You're right.
is that something that we need to be concerned about, or is that just like more of like more overregulation and stuff like that?
I think that's just for the clarity of the market, the people that produce the coffee, just because they don't want to be in a lawsuit from a business perspective. But people, again, need to understand that the dose of something makes the poison. If you're consuming so much coffee that you're getting enough acrylamide in potentially the roasting process, if you're consuming that much coffee, you're going to have other issues because you've consumed that much coffee, not necessarily because of the acrylamide.
I.e., like you're not going to be sleeping.
Yeah, or you're going to have severe like intestinal distress, amongst other issues. Your circadian biology will be completely screwed. But yeah, so
generally not anything to worry about.
no, I mean, there are risks associated with consuming any food, but again, it's also about like how you prepare it, the level of a particular carcinogen in a food, something like acrylamides in food. But again, the FDA and the EPA are very, very careful about, in general, everyone makes mistakes, right? So it has happened before where there's been recalls and even things like sunscreens, but they're owned up.
Sunscreen's baby powder.
Yeah. The mistakes have happened. Humans are prone to error. Go figure. But again, the dose of something makes the poison. Yeah.
So with more frequent use of anything, the greater your skepticism, your caution should be around a given product generally. Because I mean, you're just kind of assuming that there's a higher dose of exposure, right? With like more frequent use of a product.
Yeah, if it's known to have a particular carcinogen in it. Yeah. But our bodies can handle a certain amount of stress. Like even if I consume a little bit of acrylamide over time, our bodies don't exactly build it up and use it to cause cancer. We'll get rid of it and break it down or excrete it if it's not used.
Is there any validity to like detoxing, like compounds like acrylamide, other carcinogens that we encounter?
In general, no, because we have a kidney.
So our bodies detox. Are there ways to, I don't know, facilitate that process? Yeah.
Yeah. Again, a lot of it comes down to the things we consume, the foods we eat. Alcohol is a big contributor to producing toxic components. Alcohol is a carcinogen.
Alcohol's a carcinogen.
Yeah, alcohol is a carcinogen. But it all comes down to the things that we eat that we can control within reason. I shouldn't be consuming so much alcohol that I affect my ability to metabolize generally anything. If I excessively drink alcohol and I damage the ability or reduce the ability of my organs to metabolize foods over time, going to have negative health outcomes. One of them being, increased cancer risks. Nonetheless, fatty liver disease, alcoholic-induced fatty liver disease. So.
Is there any safe level of alcohol consumption?
Yes. Again, so our bodies can deal with it. We have ingrained mechanisms to break it down. It just so happens that in that process, we produce carcinogens. Just like, when you heat meat to a very high point, you make a carcinogen. But our bodies do that as well. But we can handle a certain amount. What's regulated, and again, it varies between people, especially people who have polymorphisms. And I'll explain what that means shortly. But like everyone has a different ability to metabolize alcohol. And so the general guideline is a light drink or light drinking is 2 drinks a day, which in my opinion is actually too much.
That sounds like
Imagine
a lot.
having like 10 beers a week.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course it's going to vary between like the amount of hard liquor because it's obviously higher alcohol content. Obviously 2 drinks of beer is a lot lower alcohol content than 2 shots of a nice bourbon or, some of that Casamigos you got. But
I'm not a frequent drinker, but I do occasionally, maybe like once or twice a month, I'll have like a glass of wine.
About the same, maybe even once a week for me. If I'm having a pretty stressful week and I just want to have a nice glass of wine with my wife at dinner or something like that. But yeah, again, a lot of it comes down with, the things that we consume, reducing our consumption of things like alcohol, maintaining, or at least doing the best we can to maintain a healthy detoxification of just maintaining our organs. Our bodies are very well developed to do this job somewhat miraculously. It's beautiful. Again, going back to that intrinsic beauty associated and the complexity associated with biology. But again, when we do consume too much something like alcohol, we can affect the ability of our organs to function together in reducing our body of toxic species that can come from like alcohol.
But again, it's like your grandma, right? Like it's like you got to stack the odds in your favor with like other healthy lifestyle habits.
Yeah. So like if I know that, I like to drink a lot, maybe I should do other things in my life, like increase my vegetable intake, eat a nutrient diverse diet, exercise, God forbid, do these things that can help to reduce my risks if, I like drinking. And a lot of people do have predispositions to, or behaviors associated, because some behavioral traits are genetically inherited as well. Some people do have predispositions behaviorally to want to consume more alcohol, the degree of which I don't understand because I'm not like a behavioral psychologist or neuroepigenetic biologist, if that's even a field. Sounds like cool, but
does.
Yeah, but everything's within our control to some extent.
What about, you touched on exercise. Is there a protective effect of exercise independent of the fact that it helps us to maintain a healthy weight? Like I've heard that, I remember actually reading it might have been like a press release from a study, but that just the act of contracting our muscles and like moving our bodies around can help. I don't know, maybe it's like facilitating lymphatic drainage.
Yeah, so the primary driver of lymphatic fluid movement is skeletal muscle contractions. How do you do that? You exercise.
So tell me about that. Like first of all, what actually is lymphatic drainage and how is that relevant to cancer?
So our immune system is tightly linked throughout our body through these lymphatic vessels. Think of it like, I was going to use a fungal metaphor, but obviously that's a little bit complicated. Fungus have these. We'll talk about this later. Sorry. I really want to talk about fungus, but we
like fungus. We like mushrooms.
Yeah, who doesn't? Mushrooms are delicious.
Mycelium. Is that where you were going
to
go?
The mycelium, the hyphae. So it's this network of mycelium, these hyphae that link colonies of different fungi to communicate. So our lymphatic system is kind of like that. It's a network of tubes essentially that go throughout our body, tightly linked with our skeletal muscle. And so our skeletal muscle, the contractile force of that muscle drives the fluid movement through a pressure gradient across our lymphatic fluid. Wow. And so our immune cells that are produced in the thymus, in our spleen, B cells, thymus T cells, our bone marrow, hematopoiesis, the origination of most of our white blood cells, the movement of those cells throughout our lymphatic system, those tightly linked network, is driven by skeletal muscle contraction. And so that's one reason, I guess it's a very big reason, why something like exercise can stimulate immune cell movement throughout your body to be able to not only respond to pathogens, which some pathogens are tightly linked to cancer, a lot of viruses, maybe even COVID for all we know. We don't know that yet. But also damage associated patterns. So our immune system is very careful about denoting the difference between a pathogen and damage, and being able to clear those in very different molecular contexts. So something like exercise will help us respond not only to viruses, but also damage. And that's also how we heal. Our immune systems help to mediate healing of tissue, even just in basic exercise of muscle tissue, by secreting these chemicals, again, these proteins, these cytokines that recruit other immune cells that bring the necessary components to a tissue or stimulate the necessary repair pathways of muscle tissue to enable something like hypertrophy if I'm like a bodybuilder or something like that, right? So, but again, this is also something that's very important regarding cancer patients that experience severe muscle wasting as their disease progresses, just even due to having cancer, not even due to like chemotherapies. Something like exercise can help them respond to immunotherapy better because it's going to stimulate that lymphatic fluid movement.
Wow.
And help to reduce cachexia, which, kills a lot of cancer patients.
Yeah. And
there are finely tuned and beautifully developed mechanisms and a bunch of Cell Nature Science papers that have been very, very well done, and a lot of preclinical studies and even observations in clinical trials upon the effects of exercise in reducing outcomes associated with cancer. But, regarding any disease, and I've said this very, very bluntly and clearly on my page, just exercise. It's the best thing you can do for yourself. I know it's a hard behavior. I've been, working out for a very long time to get myself into a rhythm where behaviorally I feel bad if I don't go to the gym or if I don't exercise. It's taken a long time. So I think people need to be understanding of their limitations and just do the best they can with trying to maintain some sort of consistent exercise regimen.
And is it like specifically resistance training, or is it basically whatever you can muster?
I don't care. I don't care what you do. There's going to be methods that are better for hypertrophy, for cardiometabolic health. I don't care. Do what you like. Get moving. That's it.
Get moving.
Just get moving.
Wow.
So even they're showing in cancer patients, at least from some very early studies, to which I can't remember all of the details right now, but some early studies are showing that even just something like walking at a brisk pace can help to increase responses to therapies in a cancer patient. So just a brisk walk. It doesn't take much effort, but for somebody who's a cancer patient, that's a lot of effort. When you're sick, the last thing you want to do is get up and walk. You need some help. So I think that it's important that we also pair, and I think something that the United States is lacking, I think we need to pair cancer patients with physical therapists who understand the nature of how cancer affects the body, and to be able to maintain or work on mobility in cancer patients to increase their likelihood not only to respond to therapies, but increase their likelihood of survival. Yeah.
Movement really is medicine.
Just move.
Just move.
Simple. Hard behaviorally, but simple in premise.
And important. Another topic that I feel like certainly deserves some nuance around it is the topic of fasting with regard to cancer. You often hear, that we've got to fast to starve the cancer cells. And then, of course, the topic of autophagy always comes up.
Right.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on fasting?
Yeah. So again, the same thing, dietary strategies can be helpful, but I think a lot of people sensationalize these dietary strategies to be more helpful than they actually are, or even be more helpful than what we understand. There currently isn't a very broad amount of evidence to suggest that these dietary strategies can be super helpful to cancer patients. They're merely suggestive at this point. So people that want to make very strong conclusions from those things are actually not considering the evidence in totality. And their statements are actually potentially causing harm, because fasting in a cancer patient, in some cancer patients, probably most cancer patients, can be actually deleterious to the progression of their disease.
And cachexia, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it can enhance their catabolism of muscle tissue, their breakdown of muscle tissue. I'm sure there will be conditions in clinical trials and preclinical studies where we'll establish, a very regulated regimen where we can introduce a fasting protocol into a person's diet along with a particular therapy. But, again, it's so complicated that we need to determine when, where, why, what we're doing these things. Right now, we just don't have enough evidence to make conclusive statements about that stuff. So we need to be careful about who's making those statements, because anyone that is making those statements, for lack of a better word, is full of crap.
Fasting is certainly, especially I think the way most people would interpret it, is a bit extreme, and the nuance that you just added to it, I think, is crucially important for people to understand. But have you looked into any of the literature on time-restricted eating? Because we had, I've looked into it a bit, and then we recently had Sachin Panda on the show who brought up some data suggesting that early time-restricted feeding, at least in patients with breast cancer, that it seemed to there is some data suggesting that it might be play a protective role.
Yeah, and again, Sachin's very well known for his work. He's a phenomenal scientist. Actually, my wife is in a circadian biology lab from a metabolic perspective. So, I'm very well aware of his work, and as he's demonstrated or even spoken about in these studies. Again, there can be implications or points in time where these time restricted feeding strategies can be helpful for breast cancer patients, but we need to determine the exact context If you did time-restricted feeding in these breast cancer patients, we also need to validate whether or not this could be useful in other types of cancers, because it could easily make other cancers worse depending on their metabolic programming.
If I recall correctly, the patients were in remission, and it's the women that were like more that tended towards earlier dinners were less prone to cancer recurrence. So they didn't have cancer. They weren't like practicing time-restricted eating with cancer. You know what I'm saying?
So this implies that there's like an endocrinology-associated response to time-restricted feeding, and perhaps like tissue repair or recovery associated with how certain tissues that are recovering from chemo or whatever are associated, whatever treatment that they had, are recovering from their particular treatment. But the degree of which that's way out of my wheelhouse. I'm not an endocrinologist. The only types of endocrinology that I understand are, how certain hormones bind to particular receptors to stimulate particular growth signals, and how we can target those from a clinical perspective. As a cancer biologist, translational therapy is my main focus of work. But there are a lot of, biologists like Sachin that do amazing molecular work to characterize and better determine when we can use these strategies to help not only treat breast cancer patients, but a variety of other cancer patients.
Super interesting. Well, just to wrap up, I just, want to kind of circle back and provide like the high level clinical pearls. So what we've covered, want to make sure that we are not overweight or obese, right? Want to make sure that we're eating a diverse diet rich in fruits and vegetables, fiber.
Yep.
You've talked about quite
lots
a bit.
Of fiber.
Yeah, lots of fiber.
Exercise.
Red meat is not implicitly carcinogenic.
Correct.
Great source of protein.
Yep. Phenomenal source of protein. So is chicken, pork,
all
those other things.
All those other things. Avoid carcinogens.
Yep.
To the best of your...
Know what they are in the first place.
Know what they are, yeah. You provided that IARC document on your Instagram.
And I'll share it again and again.
Yeah.
And I did a very, very thorough post about carcinogens and radiation, explaining the physical components, the physics-based components of radiation, and how we can identify carcinogens and be able to take necessary precautions, if we can, to reduce exposure.
Yeah.
Knowledge is power.
Knowledge is power. And you provide a ton of it on your social media.
I do my best. And I know it's overwhelming. And I've spoken about this, no matter how simple I try and make something, it's inherently not simple. What I'm doing is trying to bring people up to speed with my education, so that way I can help to provide the foundation so that we can, identify these things that can be linked to diseases and make more impactful choices about how we go about our lives. That's the most important thing. That's why my page exists.
Yeah, and you're super generous with it.
Everything I do is free, because I think that there's enough, there's already plenty of paywalls in academic literature. And, my education cost me a lot of money. I owe a lot of money to the federal government for my loans. But I think that I'd be doing myself a disservice and many other people a disservice if I didn't offer my education freely, when so many people on social media are very free with opinions that lack credibility. Yes. So the best I can do is bring my credibility to the table and do my best to explain it, and obviously show that it's not, despite simplicity, it's challenging to comprehend. I need people to critically think.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
And I was getting weaker and weaker and weaker, and I was getting really pissed at myself. Was that overtraining? Was it the beginning of my MS? And it was already sapping my athletic strength? It both could be true.
Fascinating. So it just goes to show you that exercise it's good for you in a way because it's bad for you.